A phenomenological method that we usually ascribe in its most rigorous form to the German philosopher Edmund Husserl, though it also operates earlier and parallel to Husserl in a whole variety of other philosophers in the European tradition. This sort of description of the structures of the inner consciousness. So that combination then becomes evident in notably Martin Heidegger, who at one time was the graduate research associate working with Husserl, and then in his thinking parted company with Husserl in some regards. And by the same token, people like Sartre. So that Sartre, whom you're reading next week, represents this more philosophically rigorous phenomenological method in an existentialist. Now, it's appropriate to call Kierkegaard and Nietzsche existential thinkers, existentialist, yes. It's appropriate to call these two people existentialists, but they're often delineated from the others as phenomenological existentialists by virtue of the phenomenology. What they use, that is to say, their method is a kind of existential phenomenology, a phenomenology of human existence, of the existential dimensions of human existence. But that's not what Husserl's phenomenology was developed to do. Husserl was more interested in a phenomenology of the transcendental ego. And so his original work is spoken of as transcendental phenomenology to mark it off from existential phenomenology. In no sense would you want to call Husserl an existentialist. You flunk if you do that. Yes. Yeah. What he's doing is developing a method. Now, there are other European writers who appear who also, I think, are more influenced by the earlier Husserl. And among them, I'd list the French philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty. I'd list the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur, probably the greatest living French philosopher today. He's still alive, retired, taught at University of Chicago for half a year for the last several years, teaching occasionally at the Université de Montréal, but still teaching half a year at the Sorbonne. Now I think he's retired. Incidentally, he, maybe 20 years ago, we had him as the keynote speaker for our philosophy conference when he was teaching in Montreal. He's a French Protestant in the French Reform tradition. Paul Ricoeur. Now, another name influenced by the early Husserl very much is Hans-Georges Gadamer, who is really the main figure. That doesn't look very much like Gadamer, does it? Who's really the major figure in the development of what we call phenomenological hermeneutics. Because the kind of hermeneutic that talks about subjective grids and influences intruding in the interpretive process, you see, to talk about that involves doing a phenomenology of how the subjectivity is at work in the interpretation. And it's Gadamer who has done that par excellence, you see. And that subjectivity is given excessive role in deconstructionists like Paul de Man. But it's Gadamer who really is the key philosophical figure in the development of that modern hermeneutic. Incidentally, for those of you oriented to theology, let me say the word hermeneutic is used much more broadly than just in terms of theology. It means interpretation. So it's used in relationship to science, in relationship to the social sciences, yes, in interpreting situations, interpreting human actions, you see. It's used in history, it's used in literature, all the rest of it. It's used in terms of reading a philosophical text, and so forth. So that. Now, what we want to do, first of all, is to get clear on the phenomenological method. We'll start on that today. Want to get clear on that. Want to say something about what Heidegger does with it. Then more extensively, of course, Sartre, because you're reading Sartre, as the sample of this phenomenological method. And then I want to say something about the hermeneutical tradition, and particularly Gadamer. Okay, so that's our agenda through to the end of next week. Now, what is phenomenology? Which, as a philosophical method, dominates European philosophy. In this country, it is dominant in Roman Catholic philosophy. Due, I might say, to almost a cloak and dagger story. The story being this, that in the early days of World War II, or was it just before, word got out to Husserl's former students, he was dead, that the Nazis were going to seize all his writings and destroy them because of his Jewish background. So in the depth of the night, a Catholic priest who was one of these students secreted all of the Husserl papers in the back of his car and raced across the Belgian border to the University of Louvain, Catholic University at Louvain, and secreted the Husserl archives. Now, University of Louvain had been major Catholic university in Europe, very influential. Back in 1878, the Pope had issued an encyclical in the light of all of the religious and social and philosophical developments of the 19th century, an encyclical called the Aeterni Patris, of the Eternal Father, calling for a return to the philosophical and theological resources of Thomas Aquinas. This marks the beginning of the neo-Thomist movement that has continued into the 20th century. University of Louvain immediately seized initiative and got on the bandwagon and became the center for neo-Thomist studies in Europe. Cardinal Mercier, French cardinal, located there, wrote vigorously along those lines. maintaining that Thomism was the Christian philosophy of the day. To this day, incidentally, some Catholic philosophers, if you use the phrase Christian philosophy with them, they'll be thinking of Thomas Aquinas. I remember when the Society of Christian Philosophers was organized some 10 or 12 years ago, we were discussing what the society should be called. The initial proposal was that we call it the Society of Christian Philosophy. Then it became apparent that our Catholic friends in the group thought of Christian philosophy as Thomism. And I'd been accustomed to using the term Christian philosophy for a pluralistic tradition of doing philosophy from a Christian perspective, and the ambiguity became evident. So we called it the Society of Christian Philosophers, and that eliminated the ambiguity. But in any case, the fact that in 1945, 46, 45 I guess it was, Louvain woke up to find it had the Husserl archives, changed its philosophical identity. And it became the center for phenomenological studies. And Catholics still going there became phenomenologically oriented. Among them, incidentally, was the present Pope, who, going back to Poland, has actually published phenomenological studies of his own. So, cloak and dagger story, well, not quite cloak. Yeah, cloak, but not quite dagger. Okay, on that story. So the influence there. Phenomenology is not a theory. I underscore that again. It's not a system of thought. It's not a philosophical position. It's a method, a project. And phenomenological description, as I've said, goes all the way back to Hegel. And informally in people like Jaspers and some of the other existential writers I've mentioned, like Marcel and Buber and so on and so forth. But the method as such was formulated by Husserl, at least the more technical method was formulated by Husserl, who died in 1938. Now, Husserl has three primary concerns. One is what he takes to be the failure of philosophical naturalism. The failure of philosophical naturalism. Now, he's using naturalism in the sense of purely scientific explanations of things. So that in terms of trying to find the foundations of logic, yes, on what grounds do the laws of logic rest? Or the foundations of mathematics, which is much the same thing. Or the foundations of natural science. You see, all of which have presuppositions about human knowledge and truth. In trying to provide those foundations for math, natural science, logic, all the naturalist has done is to say they're all due to non-rational processes. Psychological explanations in terms of certain psychological processes which give rise to identifying this, that, and the other. If you like, Nietzsche is giving a psychological explanation. You see, Freud is. Or historical explanations. This is the way it happened historically. Or sociological explanations, cultural influences. So Husserl is criticizing psychologism